All right, awesome. Great, wonderful. Great to see all of you. What we want to do today is just say a few more words just about chapter 1, just to introduce the Deonision. What we've done so far is we've identified the Deonision, the Apollonian and the Deonision as concepts and what they do each on 2 levels. And then so far we've read several passages in the text, right, about Nietzsche's, what he suggests about how we approach the Apollonian, how we never forget that it is in fact an image, it's a human invention. And then we talked about the passage about the man in the boat. And now what I want to do is just say a few more words about the Deonision, and then we go to chapter 2. All right, and so we've identified conceptually what the Apollonian is. It's the human idea for all form, and is also the idea of individual subjectivity. And Nietzsche had also said, and we spoke about this last Thursday, never forget, right? No matter how intense our own self feels, how real it is, how intense it is, no matter how intense reality feels, don't ever forget it's an illusion. It's kind of an Apollonian form. Don't ever forget that. And one of the ways to help us forget is the Deonision, right? So now let's read a couple of lines from the end of chapter 1, and we'll get right into chapter 2. So on the bottom of page 16, Nietzsche transitions to talk briefly about the Deonision. And he says, in the same passage, Schopenhauer has described the tremendous dread that grips human beings when we suddenly lose our way amidst the cognitive forms of appearance, because the principle of sufficient reason in one of its forms seems suspended, right? And that's kind of a dense sentence, but it's really beautiful and it's really profound, and it introduces the Deonision. Okay, so we're going to unpack it. I'm going to read it again, and we're going to unpack it because it introduces the Deonision. It introduces the Deonision both on the higher level, that the Deonision represents nothingness, it represents the abyss, it represents chaos, it represents these kind of titanic forces we can't control, right? And it also represents the Deonision on the individual level in the sense that it represents the Deonision as a kind of intoxication, as a kind of energy that is able to dissolve or deconstruct or decenter the individual, right? The Apollonian individuality. So what the Deonision does, just generally, is it decenters, it dissolves, it deconstructs, it challenges, it undermines. All of those words are synonyms of the Apollonian, right? So the Deonision is the name for that which can't be named, that which is on the other side of the name, on the other side of the word, on the other side of meaning. And because it's on the other side of meaning, and because it's present everywhere, and it's powerful, and it can't be mastered by any Apollonian form, it serves to constantly remind us of the fragility of the Apollonian, both in terms of language and morality and political institutions, and even of the Apollonian on the subjective level, on the individual level. The Deonision reminds us of one, that all form is a human invention, that subjectivity and personality is a human invention, and that these things are fragile. And the Deonision serves to deconstruct, decenter, desedimate, dissolve, challenge the Apollonian. And for Nietzsche, this is the secret to the tragic perspective, right? This is critically important. All right. So let me read the sentence again. And he's still riffing on this passage from Schopenhauer. And he says, in the same passage Schopenhauer has described, right, the tremendous dread right? And there's something kind of overwhelming about bearing witness to the Deonision, right? When we've talked about the tragic perspective in the past, and we've said just generally, look, the tragic perspective is the realization, right? The tragic perspective is the realization that language and meaning, value, and purpose are human inventions, that they're also assertions of power, and that they are asserted, their inventions and their forms, their concepts, and they're asserted as exercises of power in a world that in and of itself doesn't have meaning, value, or purpose, right? And because of that, it's fragile, right? And that always surrounding, right, swirling around the Apollonian form as morality or politics or architecture or subjectivity is this heaviness, right? This existential heaviness, right? That in and of itself, the world has no meaning, has no value, has no purpose, that all the things we create are fragile, right? And ultimately we ourselves die, so we are finite, right? And there's a kind of existential heaviness about that, right? It's overwhelming, right? In some ways it can even be terrifying, right? Because it's overwhelming. Life is difficult. Life is overwhelming. There are constant challenges to the Apollonian order in war. There's challenges to the Apollonian order in disease and COVID-19. There are challenges to Apollonian order in your own mental fragilities and your own challenges to maintain your meaning and value and purpose, right? And the Deonisian reminds us of that, right? And that's what Schopenhauer's getting at, right? He says Schopenhauer has described the tremendous dread. There's a kind of an anxiety. There's a kind of a terror. Like life, there are real parts of life that are terrifying, right? The nothingness, the abyss, chaos, the coming apart of Apollonian political orders and individual orders, right? There's a kind of terror, right? And by the way, this is for Nietzsche, this is an extraordinarily important thing never to forget and to bear witness and try to engage. And we're going to see that in chapter 3. So hold on, okay? But this is what Nietzsche's talking about, right? The Deonisian sort of forces us to bear witness to a kind of dread, an anxiety, an existential heaviness, right? And when does this existential heaviness come? When does it appear? And this is what he means, a kind of dread that grips man, that kind of comes over, seizes us, this terror, this anxiety, this overwhelming sense of awe at the nothingness, at the abyss, at the chaos, this dread that grips man when you and I suddenly lose our way amidst the cognitive forms of appearance. Right? Now that's a kind of a clumsy series of words, cognitive forms of appearance, right? But what it means are the Apollonian, the language and the morality and the political institutions and the things we build, right? The cognitive, the mental forms of appearance, whatever we invented and what do we see? Right? And what Nietzsche's talking about is that there's a kind of anxiety that grips us, that seizes onto us when we lose our way, right? When we see the nothingness behind the forms, when we see the nothingness behind the morality, when we see the nothingness behind the political institutions, right? When COVID shatters the medical industry, when COVID shatters the economy, when COVID shatters our individual dreams, we glimpse into the nothingness. It gives us a kind of glimpse that there's nothing behind it. And that's what Nietzsche means when he suddenly loses his way amidst the cognitive forms of appearance, right? It's brilliant, it's beautiful, it's powerful, right? The forms can disappear, they can be decentered, they can come apart, and there's nothing. And from time to time in life, we glimpse that. We get a glimpse into that. And by the way, I'll just repeat, for Nietzsche, that's incredibly important. He describes a tremendous terror or dread or anxiety that grips human beings when we suddenly lose our way amidst our Apollonian forms. Because, he says, the principle of sufficient reason, whatever we think mind is, whatever we think reason is, whatever we think value, meaning, value, and purpose are, all of those things become suspended. That's what he says, right? There's an anxiety and a terror that seizes us, right? Because our forms of appearance, we lose our way, they dissolve, right? And the principle of reason, I love it. The principle of sufficient reason seems suspended. Meaning is suspended, value is suspended, purpose is suspended, right? The whole Apollonian structure is suspended. It's kind of coming apart. And again, we're living this right now, right? We're living this right now, right? The cognitive form of liberal democracy is coming apart. It's being suspended. And there's a kind of nothingness about it until fascism comes. These things are fragile. The tremendous terror, anxiety that seizes human beings when we suddenly lose our way amidst our words and our meanings and our values, our human inventions, our Apollonian forms. And why do we do that? Because for many reasons, the Deonision in its many forms and its many threats has sufficiently suspended reason. Its meaning has been suspended, meaning is gone. Meaning is not applying anymore. If we add to this the dreadful and the blissful ecstasy, right? And again, the dreadful and the blissful ecstasy. For Nietzsche, there's something very powerful about this, about being able to bear witness to this and thrive in it. But this is what he means. If we add to this dread, the blissful ecstasy, which, prompted by the same fragmentation of the principium individuationis, rises up from man's innermost core, right? And so even the principle of identity, that second level of the Apollonian form, that can be suspended, that can be dissolved. Nick Dungy, our subjectivity, our personality, our identity, these things are human inventions. They're important, necessary, powerful. We do beautiful and erotic and brilliant things with them, but for all of that, they're human inventions and they're fragile. And they can be decentered. They can be suspended. They can be deconstructed. Right? And this is critical. That's the work the Deonisian does. And for Nietzsche, it's the secret to the heroic life. It's absolutely the secret to the heroic life, to the tragic perspective. Right? And again, let me just go back and repeat. Back on page 15, when he's cautioning us about the Apollonian, he says, but even when this dream reality, this Apollonian reality, is presented to us with the greatest intensity, we still have the glimmering awareness that it is an illusion. Why do we have the glittering awareness that it's an illusion? Because the effing Deonisian, as both nothingness, as both chaos, as titanic forces of nature, these things are there. They can't be managed by the Apollonian. They can't be overtaken by the Apple. They're always there. And what are they doing? They're always threatening. They're always pushing to suspend and dismantle the reason and the form and the meaning and the value and the purpose. And of course, the most ultimate form of that is death. Is death. Now, Nietzsche's going to talk about this Deonisian on both this kind of higher level The Deonision as the name or the concept for what can't be named, for nothingness, for chaos, for the abyss. And he's going to talk about it on the individual level as a kind of intoxication, right? And so he says, if we add to this dread, if we add to this anxiety, there's also this blissful ecstasy, which prompted by the same fragmentation, the fragmentation of individuality, the fragmentation of subjectivity. It rises up from inside of us because inside our own consciousness is nothing. Judith Butler famously described consciousness as a structured invisibility, right? If you think about what subjectivity is, you think about consciousness is, what personality is, it's a whole bunch of words and definitions and values, and it's kind of structured in some organized way, right? But underneath, at the very center of that, underneath of that, surrounding all that is a kind of nothingness. It's why you can have a mental breakdown and forget who you are. You can have a panic attack and come apart, and the structures of meaning, the subjectivity, the structured personality, it all comes apart. That's what he's talking about, right? The same Deonisian energy which prompts the same fragmentation of the individual. The Deonisian fragments cultures, it fragments political institutions, it fragments medical institutions, it fragments and decenters economies, and it also does so on the individual level. Prompted by the same fragmentation of individuality, he writes. And it rises up, he says, from our innermost core, right? It's because in a weird way it makes sense, right? For Nietzsche, is there an objectively true identity? No. Whatever identity is, as important and essential and necessary as it is, it's a human construction, right? So at the core of that construction, at the center of that construction, what is there? There's nothing. There's nothing, right? There's just mass that needs to be renamed, redefined, revalued. So the Deonisian operates at this higher level and on the individual level, right? And for Nietzsche, this is a good thing. This is a powerful thing. It's an essential thing. And we'll see as we get into it. But on the bottom of the page, it's important because it serves to remind us how no matter how important the Apollonian forms are, the languages, the moralities, the political institutions, my individuality, they're human inventions, and we have to remember that, one, that they're fragile, and two, that they can be reinvented. And this is what he means at the bottom of the page when he's talking about this kind of intoxication that overwhelms people. All right, we'll talk about the existential level in chapter 3, but here he's talking about this kind of intoxication, right? And he says, now the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid and hostile boundaries that have been created by human beings, right, in their words, with their definitions, with their meanings, with their values and their hierarchies and their rigid systems, right? After all, these Apollonian systems, right, their form, their order, their structure, that's kind of what they need to do, right? But remembering that no matter how rigid they are, that they're fragile and that they can be undone, this is a good thing for Nietzsche. This is the secret passage out of nihilism. This is the secret passage out of self-hatred. Remembering that the LSAT, as important as you think it is, as highly valued as it is in this Apollonian, post-capitalist, late modern society, as important as it is, as structured as it is, as valued as it is, at the end of the day, it's a construct. And it doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. Certainly, of course, you're going to die. It doesn't mean anything in that sense. But in the big scheme of things, it doesn't mean anything objectively. It's a construction. It's a human construction with its rigidity and its value and its socioeconomic sort of purposes. And the Deonisian shatters all of that. Now the slave is a free man. You're a slave to your Apollonian ideas, to your Apollonian meaning, to your Apollonian value, especially if you think all of those things are objectively true. They hold you in a kind of a rigidity and an order and a form. They've defined you, given you meaning, given you value, structured your purposes. They've got a hold of you. And if you think all of those things are true, they really have a hold on you. And now the Deonisian reminds you, the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid and hostile boundaries that distress, the hostile boundaries that cause you pain. You got 142 on the LSAT, the hostile boundaries that cause you suffering, that distress, the despotism or the impudent fashions that we have erected between human beings. These things break down. This is the key. Now the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid, structured, value, hierarchical, Apollonian words and meanings and values, all those things which in a weird way are important. Of course they're important in a weird way, but in a weird way they're not, because they're human inventions and they can be shattered. They're being shattered right now. This is what he's talking about. Now the slave is a free man. You have a chance to be free, because you can, once you bear witness, because the Deonisian has shattered your Apollonian form, it's dissolved your subjectivity, right? You have a chance to be free. Those meanings, those words and those meanings and those values that harassed you, that were hostile in a weird way to your freedom, they've been shattered. This is a good thing in a weird way for Nietzsche. Now you have a chance to be free. Free to do what? Create your own words, create your own meaning, create your own value. Now the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid and hostile meanings, he uses the word boundaries. I'll just talk about meanings, structures, forms, boxes. How's that? Boundaries as boxes. Now all the rigid and hostile boxes that distressed you and harassed you, the despotism of meaning that have been created, erected between human beings, that breaks down. Now with this kind of, now he's being kind of romantic. He says, now with this gospel of world harmony, each person feels himself not only reconciled, you kind of return, there's a kind of romanticized return to nothingness, right? There's a kind of a romanticized return to nothingness. Hey, all that shit I thought was so meaningful, and all that stuff that I thought was so important and so valuable that my parents told me, and the church told me, and the ethnicity told me, and the tribe told me, all these things that I thought were objectively true and couldn't be altered, these boxes that I've been in, it turns out that these things, they were fragile, right? And the box came apart. The box as culture, the box as your mind, it came apart. And now you're free, right? You've kind of returned in this weird, fascinating, beautiful, erotic, poetic way. You've returned to a kind of nothingness. Okay. What do you want your life to be? What do you want it to mean? What do you want it to value? Where do you want to go? What purposes are you going to arc it towards? That's what he's talking about here. Singing and dancing, he says, right? And he's being both playful and serious, right? These are moments of singing and dancing, because you have an opportunity to give your life meaning, value, and purpose. These are joyous moments in a weird way. And again, right, there's something terrifying about life. There's a kind of an existential terror, And especially when the Deonision, when you glimpse, when like Hamlet, you pull back the curtain and you see the world's fucked up and you can't fix it. Right? There's something terrifying about that. But as we will see as we get into chapter 3, if you find the courage to bear witness to that, not allow it to cripple you or terrify you or freak you out, right? If you can bear witness to it, you can become emotionally strong, begin the process of becoming intellectually creative, then you can start to sing and dance. You won't be self-hating. You won't be self-loathing. You won't get 140 on the damn LSAT and go fucking live in a closet for a month because you're ashamed. You'll be singing and dancing. The boxes are gone. Singing and dancing, man expresses himself. He has forgotten how to walk and talk and is about to fly, dancing into the heavens. So the Deonision, it decenters, it questions, it undermines, it fragments the Apollonian order and the individual identity. And there's something once simultaneously that's terrifying about that. That's true, right? You and I are going to suffer. Our dreams are going to come apart. The people we love are going to die. They're going to leave us. The pets are going to die. This shit is terrifying when, in some ways, when meaning and value and purpose kind of come apart. Of course it is. If it isn't, you're not fucking human. But at the same time, right, that knowing that that's what meaning and value and purpose is, that pessimism that Nietzsche was talking about, that realism, you see the world, you see meaning as a human invention. You see it as fragile. You see it as necessary and in this heroic attempt to give it meaning, one's life, one's world. But you understand how fragile it is, and you understand that the Deonision is gonna crush it from time to time, and ultimately in death. And if you can equip yourself with the emotional strength not to be crippled by those blows, then you can sing and dance, and then you can reaffirm, you can rename, revalue, repurpose, sing and dance. All right. So finally, 100 years later, we're done with chapter 1. All right. Now, bear with me, okay? So absolutely have this out, okay? This is Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, notes from books 2 through 10. Now, what we're going to do right now is talk about the transition. The way Nietzsche tells the story, from the transition from the Homeric era to the era of the tragic Greeks. Now, remember, we did that in a lecture a couple weeks ago, even before we got to Nietzsche. We just talked generally about the Homeric era and how it transitioned to Greek tragedy. And in book 2, Nietzsche tells us that kind of story, okay? And so follow through, right? Follow through. I tell the story that I'm going to talk us through in the book, okay? But in the outline, in the extended narrative, it's all typed out for you right there, okay? Now, the critical thing to know here, right? And again, it's in the story I tell, all right? So the critical thing to know here is that, and this is the main purpose of chapter 2, the critical thing that happens here is Nietzsche says, look, all right, so the origin of the Greek world, as we've talked about it ad nauseum, I've bored you guys to tears talking about this. The origin of the Greek world is found in these 2 epic poems by Homer called the Iliad and the Odyssey. And through those first written and rewritten poems, human inventions, asserted as power to give a geographical meaning to the Greek world and a kind of moral and legal and gendered and political meaning to the Greek world, right? That was a kind of moment for Nietzsche. right? That has a moment, and even though we can't fix its actual time because we don't know, it constitutes a kind of moment. And Nietzsche's going to tell very briefly what that moment was like, and then how that moment became another moment called the Greeks of the Tragic Age. Right? How that moment, how the Greeks that he is celebrating, right? The Greeks of Aeschylus, the Greeks of Sophocles, right? The Greeks of the Tragic Age, the Greeks that lived with Socrates, but prior to metaphysical philosophy, right? Nietzsche wants to kind of define those moments as separate and then talk about how the Greeks of the Tragic Age became the Greeks of the Tragic Age. Does that make sense? How they differentiated themselves from the Greeks of the Homeric and Apollonian age. Does that make sense? Right? Because he's telling it in kind of three parts. Right? There's the Greeks of the Homeric era, what he's going to call Homeric / Apollonian. That's why I have it here as Roman numeral 1 on the outline. And then he's going to talk about the Greeks of the Tragic Era, the Greeks that he valorizes and celebrates, the Greeks of Aeschylus and Sophocles and the Antigone. And then he's going to talk about the Greeks of the metaphysical age, Socrates and Plato and the death of tragedy. So the book is in kind of three parts. It's like an opera, right? And in book 2, he gives a very simple kind of explanation of what this original Homeric / Apollonian Greek moment was like. And then he's going to tell the story about how this Homeric Apollonian moment became the Greeks of the Tragic Age, the Tragic Era, and why that is a superior moment, why this is the moment that Nietzsche valorizes. Okay? You guys got that? Okay, so first, he talks about the Greeks of the Homeric / Apollonian moment, because even though it is true that the gods Apollo and Dionysus emerged from the Homeric traditions, absolutely, even though it is true that the Greek deities of art, the two deities of art, Apollo and Dionysus, emerged from the Homeric traditions, right? That's the origin, the source material of the Greek world. Nietzsche argues that the Homeric, the first era of the Greek world, the Homeric / Apollonian, had a specific way of understanding the relationship between the Apollonian and the Deonisian. They had a specific way of understanding the relationship between the Apollonian and the Deonisian. Okay, are you guys following me? All right, so let's go to chapter 2, page 18 and 19, and I'm going to rearrange. I'm Nietzsche's editor. Nietzsche needed a good editor. He was brilliant, but his writing's all over the fucking place. He needed a good editor. All right, so I'm going to rearrange Nietzsche's pages thematically, so we walk through this, okay? All right. Now, at the bottom of page 18, he writes, having established these general premises and oppositions, he's talking about chapter 1, right? Having established these general premises, the Apollonian and the Deonisian, and their opposition, right? They walk side by side, often in violent conflict, right? Because they represent different things, but out of that agon comes art, comes powerful human beings and beautiful art like the Antigone, right? That's what he's talking about. Having established these general premises and oppositions, let us step back, he says. Let us take a look at the Greeks. Let's take a step back. I'm going to tell you the whole story now. Briefly, of course, it's only 4 pages, right? But let's go back to the beginning. And let's take a look at these original Homerics and the way in which these original Homerics become stylized, become something new in this tragic era, the Greeks of the Tragic Age. Okay, that's what happens. So he says, let's take a look at the Greeks in order to assess to what degree and to what extent these artistic impulses were developed in them. This will lead us to a more profound understanding and appreciation of the Greek artist's relationship to archetypes. Okay, all right. So let's start at the beginning. I'm going to tell you, and again, Nietzsche's, and this kind of goes back to what we've been saying now for what feels like 100 years. I feel so bad for you guys. Nietzsche's telling us a story, right? Nietzsche's giving us his account of the origins of Western civilization, right? He's telling us a story, right? And he's telling it in a different way. And he's telling it in a different way because he thinks the story we get about Western civilization, primarily after Plato, after Christianity, after Enlightenment science, distorts the story, right? He's telling us the story. All right. So 1, 2, 4 lines down from the top of page 19. Despite all their dream literature, and Nietzsche's just having fun with the readers, right? Despite all their dream literature and the many dream anecdotes, we can only surmise, which is, again, he's being honest, right? We can only know what we know through the writing, okay? And it's a poem, right? Their writing was a human invention. What I'm writing is a human invention. Despite all their dream literature and the many dream anecdotes, we can only surmise the nature of the dreams of the Greeks, right? We're telling a story here. We're reconstructing a story. It's narrative, it's art, it's a kind of fiction. Important, necessary fiction, but he clearly he is signaling that he's not trying to give us the objective truth as this. He's not saying, let me give you the truth of the origin of Western civilization, right? Not at all. No truth can be given because you can't get back to it. But we can do, he says, we can only surmise, really, the nature of the dreams of the Greeks, but we can do so with a fair degree of assurance. We can tell a story. Now, 4 lines down, and he's talking about the first moment of self-creation, of Greek self-creation. He's talking about the first moment of Greek self-creation, the Homeric moment. He says their perfection, talking about these Homeric Greeks, talking about Homer, talking about the Greeks that we think lived between 750 and 650 BC. Because we can only speculate because we have no fucking idea when the Homeric epic was, right? Their perfection, these Homeric Greeks, this first moment in Greek civilization, their perfection, if comparison is possible, would certainly justify us in describing the dreaming Greeks as Homers, and Homer as a dreaming Greek in a more profound sense than that in which the modern man might compare himself to a dreaming Shakespeare. Right? This is really beautiful, right? He says, back in chapter 1, he says, the ideas and the images, he talks about of the two gods of art, Apollo and Dionysus, right? But he means all images and ideas, all of those things come to us from our dreams. They come to us literally inside of our minds. They're figments of human imagination, right? So Homer was the first to create as a figment of imagination, as this kind of poetic illusion, as this dream reality, the Greek world. That's what he's talking about. Homer was the first dreaming Greek as a metaphor, right? Because what did he or they do? They wrote these poems. The poems got rewritten. From the poems emerged the entire worldview that we call the Homeric traditions, from which Western civilization derived. Right? So he's just returning to a motif he's been talking about already, right? Right? The Greek world, is it an objectively real thing or is it a human invention? It's human invention. Why? Because it derives in this kind of wild way through two epic poems that are artistic. They're aesthetic experiences. Where did all that shit come from? From the mind of someone called Homer. So there he is, right? And he's retelling you this story. Their perfection, if comparison is possible, would certainly justify us in describing the dreaming Greeks as Homers, and Homer as a dreaming Greek. Okay, so this Homeric era is a human invention. It emerges out of just assuming Homer was a real person. You don't know, but for the sake of the argument, we're just going to talk that way, right? Okay, so Homer dreamed up the Iliad and the Odyssey. He invented the Iliad and the Odyssey out of the Iliad and the Odyssey as a work of art. And not just as a work of art, but as an assertion of power. Out of that human invention and assertion of power, out of that meaning, that value, and those purposes, come the Greek world. From that world eventually comes Greek tragedy. From that world eventually comes Plato. And from that world eventually comes Western civilization. Now, what were the main characteristics of this time? Right? What were the main characteristics of this time? And how do the main characteristics of this Homeric, Apollonian moment, this original moment, differ from Greek tragedy? That's what we're about to do right now, okay? You guys following me? Good. Yeah, I'm going to take your silence as a yes, because you're all on mute. All right. Now, we need to go to the bottom of the page and count up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines from the bottom of page 19. It would seem, find the sentence that begins, it would seem, okay? It would seem that for some time, however, the Greeks, these Homeric Greeks, these Homeric Apollonian Greeks, it would seem that for some time, and by the way, that some time is 750 to 650, that's the Homeric era, and then there's another 200 years between 650 and 450, right? There's 200 years that separate the end of what we think was the Homeric era and the beginning of Greek tragedy, right? Which, by the way, we know nothing about, right? And that's what he means. It would seem that for some time, this time from 750 BC to 450 BC, right? This Homeric era, before and while what would become the Greeks of the tragic age were beginning. It would seem that for some time, however, Nietzsche writes, the Greeks, these Homeric Greeks, were thoroughly secured and protected against the febrile excitements of the Deonision. Okay? Knowledge of which forced its way to the Greeks along every route of land and sea. And in this original Homeric moment, Nietzsche writes, the figure of Apollo, the symbol of form, the symbol of a kind of rationality, the symbol of a kind of morality and structure and order and political institutions, right? The Apollonian as symbol for all human form, symbol for a kind of human subjectivity. And the figure of Apollo rose up in all of its pride and held out the Gorgon's head to the grotesque, barbaric Deonision, the most dangerous force it had to contend with. It was in Doric art and sculpture, literally in Doric art, in the temples and the sculptures of the temples, the majesty of the temples. It was in Doric art that Apollo's majestically repudiating stance was immortalized. Okay, so this is critical. What is he saying? In this first Homeric moment, right, the relationship between the Apollonian and the Deonisian was much more, it was much more hostile, and it was much more rigid, right? These Homeric Greeks symbolized in Apollo, symbolized in structure and form and a kind of strict morality, hierarchical social and political institutions, right? This Homeric Apollonian form saw the Deonisian as an existential threat, right? Saw it as barbaric, saw it as grotesque, and sought, and here's the key, sought to keep it out. Sought to keep it out, right? So again, it would seem that for some time, the Greeks of the Homeric era, this Homeric / rigid Apollonian era, the Greeks of the Homeric era were thoroughly secured and protected, right? They secured and protected themselves from the feeble intoxication, the threatening energy of the Deonisian. And he uses the word festival because that's how it came. Knowledge of which, knowledge of the Deonisian, which forced its way to the Greeks along every route of land and sea. And in this original Homeric Apollonian moment, you have this zero-sum contest, this existential contest between the Apollonian and the Deonisian. And Nietzsche writes, the figure of Apollo, the image, the concept of Apollo, the idea of all human form, of language, of morality, of reason, of architecture, of order, hierarchical political order, social order, economic order, right? The figure of Apollo, the image of this order in all of its pride, right? In a way that was justified. It's beautiful, it's profound what's being created. In all of its pride, held out the Gorgon's head to the grotesque, barbaric Deonisian. So this first moment saw the Deonisian as barbaric, as grotesque. And it saw it as the most dangerous force it had to contend with. So there was this kind of zero-sum conflict between the Apollonian and the Deonisian. Now, go to the next page, page 20, and go to the bottom of the page. And go 1, 2, 3, 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Just to finish out this thought, I'm reconstructing Nietzsche's thoughts. I'm editing Nietzsche's chapter here. Care. There's a sentence 4 lines from the bottom that starts, care was taken. By whom? These Homeric Greeks. Care was taken to ensure that the one element held to be non-Apollonian, extraordinary care was taken to ensure that the one element held to be non-Apollonian was excluded. The very element of which Dionysian music consisted, music and intoxication, the overwhelming power of sound. Okay, so in this original Homeric moment, these Homeric Greeks saw the Deonisian as grotesque and barbaric. And they protected themselves. They secured themselves. They kept it out. They kept it out because they saw it as barbaric and grotesque. And why? This is critical. Why did they keep it out, and why did they see it as barbaric and grotesque? Because they understood perfectly well the power of the Deonisian, both in terms of a kind of intoxication coming in these festivals, coming in music, coming in intoxication, coming as the image, ultimately as a satire. And they saw the Deonisian as this kind of Persian invasion, this kind of force, this existential force that has the power to dissolve all Apollonian form, all Homeric culture. And so this extraordinary care and this effort was kept at keeping the Deonisian out. But, as Nietzsche's going to say, and this is the but that explains the transition from the Homeric Greeks to the tragic Greeks. This is the but something happened, Nietzsche says. Right? Something happened. And this something happened explains the transition from the Homeric Greeks to the tragic Greeks. So what happened? Bottom of page 19. Back to page 19. This resistance. What resistance? The resistance of the original Homeric Greeks to do what? To keep the grotesque and barbaric Deonisian out. This attempt, right? And something really profound here is going on, you guys, right? This attempt, this Apollonian attempt, this rigid form of morality and social hierarchy and political hierarchy and religious hierarchy and order with its temples and its rigidity, right? In a weird way, it understood the threat that the Deonisian represented to this, both existentially and individually. And it worked. Care was taken to keep it out. In a weird way, just like you and I, and our utterly obsessive enlightenment, pathological concern for self-discipline. Structure my calendar, structure my day, organize my time, organize my minutes, get control of my life and self-discipline. If I just if I just schedule the day more efficiently, if I just drink less and party less, just get structure, get control over every minute of every day and every assignment, everything. Right? What we call success, what we call self-discipline. Hey, that Nick Dungy, he's a good guy. He's a valuable guy. Why? Because he works really fucking hard. Right? Right? He's really structured. He's punctual. He's on time. He works really hard. Right? He's self-disciplined. He's Apollonian. He's rigid. He's successful. Right? Even now, that's in a weird way, even now, that's our archetype. And to become that, which is what we're raising kids to become, which the university is telling you to become, what the culture is telling you to become, it's forcing you to become that. What do you have to do? You've got to resist the Deonisian. Right? You got to resist anything that can threaten and undermine and decenter the order, the meaning, the value, the purpose. Right? And you're rigid about it. It's kind of familiar because we've reinvented this Homeric Apollonian moment in the Enlightenment in this bizarre way. But what Nietzsche's saying is that this resistance, which, by the way, because the more you try to order your time and to organize your life and to become self-disciplined, hardworking, and be valuable to the institution and to the fucking factory and to the culture and to the parents and to the race and the tribe, right? The more you try to do that, the more everything slips through, the more fragile it becomes. This resistance became more questionable, Nietzsche says, even impossible, top of 20, when similar Deonisian impulses emerged from the deepest roots of Greek culture. Oh, right? Right? Because originally, the Apollonian and the Deonisian, these are Greek gods. These are art deities that emerge out of the Homeric tradition. So the Deonisian, as an invented god, as the word for what can't be named, right? For the powers of intoxication that dissolve for happy hour, right? For the powers of intoxication that undermine your Apollonian obsession with self-discipline and perfection and productivity and efficiency, right? Ultimately, keeping the Deonisian out is impossible because it's inside of us. It emerges from its own culture. That's what he says. The resistance became more questionable, even impossible, when similar Dionysian impulses emerged from the deepest roots of Greek culture. Now all the Delphic god Apollo could do was to disarm his powerful opponent in his destructive weapon by effecting a timely reconciliation. Okay, now let's go back to 19. What do you mean this reconciliation? What is this reconciliation between the Apollonian and the Deonisian that he just talked about? Right? The resistance, keeping the Deonisian out, shutting oneself off from it, keeping it out is impossible. Some bearing witness to the presence and the power and the beneficial elements of the Deonisian is necessary. Some reconciliation with the Deonisian is necessary. Right? A bearing witness. What are we talking about? A bearing witness to the nothingness of the world, to the terror of the world, to the fragility of subjectivity rent by intoxication. Right? What is some reconciliation, some bearing witness with all of this is necessary and powerful. Go back to page 19. So what was going on during this time when the Homeric Greeks were trying to secure themselves from the barbaric Deonisian? What's going on? Right in the middle of the page. 19. From all corners of the ancient world, from Rome to Babylon, we can demonstrate the existence of Dionysian festivals, which are at best related to the Greek festivals as the bearded satyr. There it is, the bearded satyr. Deriving his names and attributes from the goat is related to Dionysus himself. Almost universally, the center of these festivals was an extravagant lack of sexual discipline, whose waves engulfed all the venerable rules of family life. The most savage beasts of nature were here unleashed. Even the repellent mixture of lust and cruelty that I have always held to be the witch's brew. This is Burning Man. He's describing fucking Burning Man. He's describing a lost weekend with 4 tabs of ecstasy and glow sticks. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about Carnival. He's talking about Mardi Gras. Almost universally, the center of these, what's going on in these festivals? Right now, he's talking about it as intoxication, as a kind of, as music, as intoxication, and its ability to undermine the rigid Apollonian order. He's talking about Burning Man. He's talking about running around in the desert, butt naked, on 3 tabs of ecstasy with fucking glow sticks. I just read about that. Don't ask me about that. I read it on the internet. What he's talking about. He's talking about Mardi Gras. He's talking about Carnival. It's called Bacchanal. Almost, and what's going on here? Almost universally, the center, the energy of these Dionysian moments was an extravagant lack of sexual discipline. So the first thing that gets deconstructed, the first thing that gets decentered are the rules, are the norms, the form, the moral rules, the physical rules, the norms about human sexuality. Right? Burning Man, everybody's half naked. Couple tabs of ecstasy and all the norms about distance and sexuality and touching and the body, all of those things dissolve in an instant. Almost universally, the center of these festivals was an extravagant lack of sexual discipline, whose waves engulfed all the venerable rules of family life. The most savage beasts, right? You're at Burning Man. You can do what you feel, right? And you've gone out in the middle of the desert because you can't do it in Silicon Valley. You've left Facebook, you've left fucking Google, right? You've left YouTube, you've gone out into the fucking Nevada desert, you've dropped a couple tabs of E, you're running around half naked, and now all the rules are gone. That's what he's talking about. The most savage beasts were unleashed. Even that repellent mixture of lust and cruelty. All right. Next page. Right in the middle of the page. Here we go. Now we are transitioning into the Greeks of the Tragic Age. It was here. It was during these Deonisian moments. It was here that nature was first given its artistic celebration. Here that the breakdown of the principle of individuality became an artistic phenomenon. That terrible witch's brew of lust and cruelty had now lost its potency, and only the peculiar blend and duality of emotions amongst the Deonisian revelers recalls it, as medicines recall deadly poisons. The phenomenon that pain is experienced as joy. 4 lines down. The chanting and the gestures of these Deonisian revelers with their dual inspiration was something new and unheard of in the Homeric and Greek world. And Dionysian music and intoxication in particular induced feelings of awe and terror. Okay. So what has just happened? Nietzsche is going to argue that the tragic Greeks become the tragic Greeks. Here's the movement. From the Homeric world, all rigidity, all form, all discipline, all order, all structure and hierarchy. How does that Homeric world become the world of the Greek, of the tragic Greeks? And that happens because the tragic Greeks, Aeschylus and Sophocles, the Greeks that survived 50 years of Persian invasion and existential extinction, the Greeks of the tragic age understand that the Dionysian can't be kept out, that some bearing witness to existential terror, to the intoxication and the deconstruction of moral rigidity and legal rigidity and cultural rigidity from time to time is a powerful and good thing. The tragic Greeks bear witness, make reconciliation with the Dionysian, both as existential terror and as intoxication. And they make sort of reconciliation with it by bringing it into the culture. This is the key. They bring the Deonisian into the culture. They bring it into their culture in these festivities, in these Deonisian festivals, which are consciously done to dissolve rigidity from time to time. And here we go, the critical moment. They bring it in the art. They understand, they bring it into the culture as an understanding of the fragility of cultural norms, of cultural meaning and order. Right? They bring, rather than keeping the Deonisian out, which is impossible, resistance became impossible. They bring it in. And that's why Nietzsche uses the metaphor of a vaccine to struggle with the Deonisian, to bear witness to it, to reconcile with it in some way. The Greeks of the tragic age, in their art, in their thinking, in their culture, bring the Deonisian in. They bring it in. Right? And the Antigone, the Sophocles' tragedy, is a perfect example of that. If you look at the Antigone, it is this beautiful, artistic, heroic in creation of the terror of life, of the conflict of life, of the finitude of life, of the nobility of dying to give your life meaning and value, rather than being a slave, rather than being oppressed. The hero is Antigone, not Ismene. So Nietzsche, this is a critical moment. The Greeks of the tragic age become heroic. They become powerful because they give themselves a little of the Deonisian as a vaccine. You think about what a vaccine is, right? You think about what measles vaccine are. Prior to the 1930s, the measles killed hundreds of millions of people. Still killed hundreds of millions of people. Maybe not that many, but it still kills people around the world. Now we have a measles vaccine. What's a measles vaccine? We isolate a measles virus, and we do something with it. We neutralize it, and then we give it to the body, so the body can learn how to fight it. We give ourselves the disease so we can fight it. And that's what Greek tragedy is. These Greeks of the tragic age gave themselves the Deonisian as a vaccine. Of course, the vaccine doesn't eliminate the Deonisian, just like the measles vaccine doesn't eliminate measles. Measles is all over the world. But it helps fight it. And that's what he's talking about. Bottom of the page. And his astonishment would have been intensified by its combination with the terror. Not in the end so strange to him that his Apollonian consciousness alone, like a veil, hid the Deonisian world from his view. Okay. So the Greeks of the tragic age become heroic because they bring in the Deonisian, both in terms of these Deonisian festivals, which dissolve order on a personal level, and as we will see in chapter 3 on Thursday, at the existential level, in the bearing witness to the terror and the nothingness of the world and the heroic need to resist it as best as one can. All right. I took 2 minutes of your time. I'm sorry.
Professor, I have one question.
Yep, go for it, Jacob.
So we know now why Nietzsche describes the tragic Greeks as heroic, and we now know why he describes metaphysical Greeks as weak and sickened. So my question is, how does Nietzsche really describe the Homeric Greeks again? And
yeah, he celebrates the Homeric Greeks, right? Because what did they do? Homer invents the Greek world. Homer invents Western civilization, right? That's extraordinary.
Right.
But in their original moment, right, the relationship between the Apollonian and the Deonisian was incredibly hostile.
Okay.
These Homeric Greeks saw the Deonisian as barbaric and grotesque and threatening. And in a weird way, they were correct, right? It is all of that stuff. But because they saw it that way, they tried to keep it out, right? They were overly rigid, overly structured, overly moral, overly formed, structured, right? And they tried to resist it. There was no reconciliation. There was no bearing witness to it, right? In this kind of heroic way. But that was impossible. Not possible to do that. And so the tragic Greeks become the tragic Greeks because they find a way to bring the Deonisian into the culture. They bring it into the art. The Antigone is the beautiful rendition of existential terror, of suffering, right? That they bring it in, right? Tell the truth. The Antigone, in a weird way, tells the truth about life. That it's a conflict over meaning and who gets to determine it. And sometimes that causes death. It's extraordinary. And yet here is this extraordinary play. Here's this epitome of human achievement. It tells beautifully the heaviness and the terror of life. And in doing it beautifully, it spiritualizes it. It overcomes, in a weird way, it transcends it just for a little while. That's the key, until death.
Thank you.
All right, I need a drink.
Professor?
Yep.
Sorry, just one more really quick question.
Uh-huh.
In the very last part of the midterm, you asked us to talk about the birth of tragedy and like the way that Socrates and Plato destroy tragic drama. While I personally feel like I could answer the question, you did say earlier that we weren't going to get to that portion. So
you're not responsible for it.
Okay, so just cross out basically that last part.
Yeah, breaks my heart, but yeah, we don't have time. All right, you guys, see you Thursday. We're going to do chapter 3 and 4. Yeah, Ruth?
So we don't do the last question?
Nope.
No.
Nope. Like I said, you're not responsible for books 10 through 14 because we're out of time. We got to get to Foucault.
Professor, as well, could I please talk to you after class?
There is no office hours today.
Okay, thank you. Could I email you then?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got 160 midterms that are coming in right now. Talk about the Deonisian, right?
Okay.
Talk about terror. I've got 160 exams that I've got to deal with. So email me.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Yep. Love you guys. Have a good night. We'll see you Thursday.
See you Thursday.
So much, Professor.
Bye.